Welcome to all of you to this fifth in the new series of lectures on Azadi. Vanakkam to our comrade and colleague from Chennai, Geeta. It's my great pleasure to introduce Geeta, who, apart from being a long-time acquaintance and friend, is also an extremely well-known writer and translator, and above all, activist. She has interpreted various aspects of Tamil Nadu politics to the rest of the country and the world, and I don't need to mention the many books she has authored, except to single out two which will be known, I'm sure, to this entire audience. One is the book she co-authored with Rajadurai called Towards the Non-Brahmin Millennium, and a very useful introduction to patriarchy, which has been used in a variety of courses on gender. She is also working in a publishing house, but she has many kinds of activities to her credit. And we are very fortunate to have her with us today in the series on Azadi, because she is otherwise a very busy person, and in fact has to return to organize yet another week-long series of events in Chennai itself. So thank you, Geeta, for taking the time out to be with us and expressing this solidarity here. We look forward very much, and without any further ado, to her lecture, which is entitled Injustice Has No Tradition, Thinking Through Liberty and Equality. Geeta?
Good evening. Feels very strange to be here after seeing everything on television. And I'm glad to be speaking on something that has been resonant for the last few weeks across the country, on freedom, on Azadi. And without much ado, I will get on with what I want to do this evening. I want to start by referring to this rather shrill patriotism that is in evidence all around us, and more than any of us, all of you in JNU have been witness to that sort of insistence that we all be citizens of a certain kind, and makes you wonder if what is this nationalism that we are all meant to subscribe to. It changes from moment to moment. It seems whimsical, it seems fanciful, and if it wasn't so menacing and frightening, downright absurd. Be that as it may, that seems to be part of what we have to contend with as we try and understand the meanings of words that are very dear to some of us, including freedom, equality, fraternity, compassion, fellowship, and many others that belong to that family of words. And clearly these are words that we need to fight for and fight over and fight amongst each other perhaps sometimes, to get a sense of their rich complexity, their many histories, and so on. And what's very evident is also that the meanings that we want, to sort of debate over are often brushed aside through a kind of sleight of hand, so that any kind of dissension is read to mean disloyalty. Principal critique of the nation state is sort of seen as an affront to national honor, and just the right to express independent opinions is seen as sedition. And I want to spend a few minutes thinking about language here, because I'm reminded of that moment in Alice in Wonderland when Alice and Humpty Dumpty have this conversation about words. So Alice says, the question is, which is to come first, the noun or the verb? And Humpty Dumpty says, the question is, who's to be master? And I think there is something about language that is at stake here for those of us who are active in a public context, because clearly there is an attempt to exercise mastery over words, so that words such as terrorist or militant or anti-national or traitor can be used in ways that have enormous consequences for those that are the targets of these words. And therefore I think words are precious, and words are something that we need to think through and quarrel over. Words that we discussed amongst ourselves, words that we are intimate with, words that we fight over. And so what I intend to do today is to look at some of these words, particularly liberty and equality, and look at it in the context of a very distinct register. A register that is the common inheritance of what I call anti-caste radical thought in this country, which goes back a long way to, if you like, to Mahatma Phule, but which also is a fairly continuous tradition across different parts of India. And as newer generations of researchers point to anti-caste activism across the country, one is sort of seeing evidence of more and more ideas that have emerged from within this context, not just in the traditional enclaves of anti-caste activism, which is Western and Southern India, but also the Northern Indian plains and parts of Central India. So this is a tradition that I wish to speak of. And I want to start off by saying that words mean different things in different places. It's a truism. The words also mean different things at different times. So for example, take the word Azadi. Communists who used it with great aplomb and welcomed it in August 1947, a few months later called it a false freedom. Azadi Jhoot is a phrase that many of us know from that time. Or take a word like injustice. Now, in the context of caste society, injustice ideally ought to have no further, it need not carry any further explanatory burden. But injustice is something that is constantly defended in myriad ways. It's legitimized, it is over-explained, it's over-interpreted, and it is in one such context that Babasaheb Ambedkar coined this very famous line, injustice has no tradition. And that, I think, is a very powerful statement, because in that one sentence you have encapsulated an entire way of looking at our past and our present. So whatever our engagement with history and whatever the nature of our engagement with the present, it's very clear that there is a form of injustice that cannot be explained away, that is very much part of our existential everyday reality, since we are all in some ways, whether we wish to or not, part of caste Hindu society. Even those that have opted to be outside the fold, find that they are sort of forced to act within the shadow of the caste order in one way or the other. So I want to sort of use Ambedkar's phrase, injustice has no tradition, to sort of think through the relationship between liberty and equality, which I think is an interesting question, because I think this also has a kind of resonance in the sort of politics that has emerged over the past few weeks, and which in a very long historical sense has also been a politics that different kinds of political groups have contended with, certainly in Western and Southern India, which is the politics of the left and the politics of Ambedkarism, or in Tamil Nadu, the politics of the self-respect movement. And the manner in which one sort of thinks through these two traditions of protest, the manner in which they relate to each other, this simply cannot be an instrumental sort of relationship, something that, one cannot be stitched onto the other easily, nor can these slogans be brought together in very opportune ways. I think there are real difficulties in pulling them together, but not of a kind that you can't actually speak about them. So part of what I say will also refer to the relationship between a politics of class and between a politics of anti-caste radicalism, though not in a direct sense, but hopefully what I say will illuminate some of those issues. So what I want to do then is to start with something that, a kind of protest that happened just about the same time as the events in Hyderabad Central University and later on in JNU. This actually is a protest that started on December 10th. On December 10th, 2015, a group of men and women and children resolved to undertake a 125-day yatra to put an end to manual scavenging. So organized by the Safai Karamchari Andolan, they set off from Delhi and they wanted to do this tour of India before they returned to Delhi on April 14th to submit a petition to the central government asking for a immediate abolition of manual scavenging. So this was called the Beam Yatra, and it started from Assam and it made its way down to Tamil Nadu, then did the southern states, went into western India, and finally it's I think currently in Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, I'm not quite sure where at the moment. But this is an amazing exercise, because what you actually saw, those of us who had the opportunity to be part of the Yatra when it was traveling through our states, we saw that here was a moment, it was a sort of strange secular pilgrimage. I want to use the word pilgrimage in a sort of limited sense because it is called the Yatra after all. And in the words of one of the organizers, the Yatra that they were undertaking had a twin purpose. One was to invoke the memory of Ambedkar in the 125th year of his anniversary and speak of how, without any shame or remorse, the practice of manual scavenging continues. And if anyone wants to sort of actually honor his 125th year, the most important thing that they ought to do is to work towards abolishing manual scavenging. That was one purpose of the Yatra. The other purpose was to quote from their document that this stark pilgrimage was to sort of seek an unconditional apology from the government of India, imaged here as representing the people of India, and I quote, for the historical injustice and centuries of humiliation heaped on us by engaging us as manual scavengers. And further, the Yatra was also imaged as something that went against what one of the participants termed an everyday Yatra of imposed intolerance. And what's interesting is that the Yatra attempts to do several things at the same time. One is sort of invoke a sense of shame, which those who participate in it imagine that confronted with manual scavenging, you would feel shame. In city after city, after all, it was sort of found outside the main administrative buildings. The participants addressed the collector of the district in the districts and local government authorities if it was less than a district in taluks and so on. So there it was in a public context calling attention to a practice which is so abominable that it was imagined that to repeatedly talk about it would instill shame. But sadly, if you go through the daily mails that the Yatriks sent out and what happened on day 5, day 6 and so on, you would see that except perhaps in a few places in Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh, very often it was those Dalit communities that are engaged in manual scavenging that received them. Very rarely did other democratic activists or other groups were part of what they attempted to do. So the kind of public shame that they imagined would emerge because here they were calling attention to this practice day after day, sadly did not happen at all. So it's something worth thinking about because if one does not experience shame in imposing the task of cleaning what one discards as waste from oneself, what one discards as waste through one's actions, and imagines that an entire community is fit only for doing that. The horror of it is something that sort of, at one level, beggars description. But it is so everyday, it is so visible. I mean, who doesn't see a Safai Karamchari on their way to work or wherever that they go? It's so everyday and it's so invisible. So the horror of that, the entire negativity of that experience, and listening to families of those workers who had lost their lives because they were forced to go into a sewage hole or because they had contracted all kinds of diseases when they were made to clean places that were very filthy, like what happened after the Chennai floods, when an entire troop of workers were brought in from the districts to clean the streets of Chennai. So when the visibility of the task is something that can go unnoticed, it's so visible and yet it can go unnoticed, then one can only conclude that there is a manner in which caste Hindu society expresses its own self of what it is by refusing to acknowledge that one part of it is being dehumanized in an everyday sense. So it is not simply that the fate of the Safai Karamcharis is at stake, but we are also forced to think of what is this self that would allow this thing to be day after day. What kind of selfhood would actually allow such a thing to exist? And here I'm reminded of something that Dr. Ambedkar wrote. I think it's one of his unfinished fragments in an essay that is titled Frustration. It's a slightly long quote, but I want to read it in fullness. And I quote, the untouchables are the weariest, most loathed and the most miserable people that history can witness. They are spent and sacrificed people. Many people suffer such frustrations in their history. but they soon recover from the blight and rise to glory again with new vibrations. The case of the untouchable stands on a different footing. Their frustration is frustration forever. They have nothing in their dull, drab, deadening past for a hope of a rise in the future. This is due to no fault of theirs. And then Ambedkar goes on to describe for what could redeem this situation, and he calls it a plus condition of mind. And he says, I quote again, in a society where there is exemption from restraint, a secured release from obstruction, in a society where every man is entitled not only to the means of being, but also well-being, where no man is forced to labor so that another may abound in luxuries, where no man is deprived of his right to cultivate his faculties and powers, so that there may be no competition with the favored, where there is goodwill towards all. And later on, of course, he would gloss his goodwill in his Buddha and his Dhamma as Maitri, or social fellowship, as a supreme sort of virtue that is the perfect antidote to Manudharma, so to speak. But I think whether it is the protest of the Safai Karamcharis or Ambedkar's sort of extremely painful sense of isolation and anger, which I think he experienced in a very acute fashion in the late 40s on the eve of India becoming independent, when he wasn't at all sure whether the freedom and equality that he desired, especially for Dalits, would be made part of what he called the instrumentalities of governance. So I think this piece of writing belongs to that phase, but I think what's important is, in as much as it tells us about the fate of the untouchables, it also tells us something about caste Hindu society, what it's capable of, and what it does day after day without suffering a twinge of remorse or shame. And I want to stay with that thought for a while, because something here begs critique and analysis. When freedom is thwarted, when our right to expression of ideas is thwarted, we claim this freedom. We want it for ourselves and we want it for everybody else, and we pit ourselves against the state. But what happens when the source of unfreedom and when the source of inequality is ourselves? When it belongs to the realm of the social order itself? And I think that is a question that anti-caste movements have asked time and again, and therefore set up this very interesting tension between liberty and equality. The claims of political freedom and the claims of social equality. How do you sort of talk about these two? Are they claims that are commensurate with each other? Should one sort of claim have priority over the other? Who prioritizes, for what purpose, and so on? And I think these are important questions that we need to stay with. But before I come to some of them, I also want to refer to another incident, and this is also something that perhaps happened around the same time as the protests in Hyderabad and Delhi. And in Tamil Nadu, this is part of a sort of 2 or 3 year old, over a period of the last couple of years or 3 years, we've witnessed some very horrendous things happening in our home state. And the latest is this brutal daylight murder of a young Dalit man. He was hacked to death on the streets for marrying a woman who is not from his caste and who is from not even a dominant caste from the region, but who is not Dalit. And this is the latest in a series of murders. The one that many might remember is the suicide of Ilavarasan, who married Divya, a woman from what you would call an OBC caste, while he is Dalit, and an entire Dalit neighborhood was razed to the ground as a sort of punitive expression of OBC anger. And subsequently there have been other deaths of Gokul Raj, another engineering student. Again, it was suspected that it had something to do with a woman that he loved who was not a Dalit. Then the Dalit woman police officer who was investigating that case committed suicide. And it's not quite clear whether it's suicide or murder again, or whether she was pushed to commit suicide. And these deaths tell us something about the status of equality and liberty in a state which has had a long history of talking about the evils of Brahminical thought and of the evils of the caste system. That they should happen now, of course, is something that we need to discuss, but I don't know if that is what I want to do today. But what I actually want to do is to look at what is at stake for those who seek to be indifferent to what Safai Karamcharis endure. What is at stake for those who actually think it is all right to murder someone for daring to exercise his choice in matters of emotional and sexual intimacy. So what are the values that are at stake here? And it seems to me with the Safai Karamcharis, what you see is what is termed sociologically as stigmatized labor. But I would actually like to relate it to fundamentally the negation of freedom itself. You might remember that there is this fantastic moment in Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, where in his gloss of freedom, he links freedom to the right to actually exercise choice when it comes to the labor that one wishes to undertake, and how the caste order refuses this freedom to almost all those that are part of its hierarchy. And Ambedkar goes on to talk about this in terms of the profound alienation that it creates in those that labor at tasks that they don't wish to labor on, and how it affects your sense of what you do as well as how you do it. And he would pick up this theme again later on in his later writings in the philosophy of Hinduism, where he sort of locates unfreedom in the inability of many of us to choose to do what we think we ought to be doing. And if you sort of place the fate of the Safai Karamcharis in this context, you will see that what they are protesting against is a denial of azadi in a very fundamental, almost ontological sense. Because what is being denied is also something that they have to bear the burden of on their bodies. They are denied the freedom to choose to do whatever else they would like to do, and made to do what is imposed on them. They bear the burden of that on their very bodies. Forced to clean with the toilets with their hands, forced to go down sewage holes. So there is a certain sort of ontological wounding that you see, which actually makes us rethink the entire question of freedom itself. So when we talk of azadi, how do we sort of relate to such an experience of unfreedom? That is at one level. And you also realize that this is something that Ambedkar again tried to understand using the notion of graded inequality, because basically the caste order, if no one is equal to anyone else except those that are on the top, and if it is impossible to sort of express a sense of fraternity or a sense of self that cuts across caste divisions, then there's no possibility of equality at all. And if there's no possibility of equality at all, then there may be no possibility of thinking about freedom, because equality is a precondition for actually wanting to be free. So it's a kind of fairly closed and sterile exercise in trying to think of freedom and equality within the caste order, and which is why Ambedkar went on to say all that he did about caste, Hinduism, exiting from Hinduism, and so on. Now, when you come to the stories of these thwarted lovers, of all these young Dalit men who have been killed and murdered, and who've simply been disappeared from their context, you see that what is being resented here is not simply the right to assert oneself in matters of sexual and emotional choice, but also the right to imagine that you can actually be a different kind of human person, that you can actually be a different kind of human being. And I think it is this that caste Hindu society cannot understand, because the kind of human person that caste Hindu society sort of engages with on a daily basis is a person who is half fragmented, and as Ambedkar very famously described it, your sense of self is defined by your location in the caste order, with an ascending scale of reverence and a descending scale of contempt. So in that sense, what is your sense of self? And if you want to hold on to that precious sense of fragmentary personhood that you experience, someone who steps outside of it, who claims something that is not part of it, obviously demands to be punished, right? And that punishment is inevitably gendered. No surprise at all. And so what do you see happening to these young women from the other backward caste or the backward caste, as the case may be? And here you see, for women who seek to opt out of the social order, liberty takes the form of love. And to love is to rebel, but to love is also to be defined by the experience of caste conjugality, even if you're breaking the caste system. So, for Dalit men though, the choice to love is of a part with a larger domain of expansive freedom that they wish to access, whether it's in terms of labor, whether it's in terms of intellectual mobility, whether it's in terms of exit from the caste system. Whereas for OBC women, for these young women, the experience of love, which is actually an assertion of liberty, is something that immediately closes them back into the family in very sort of violent way, so to speak. Whether they are punished by their own natal families or whether they find themselves isolated, whatever it is, they cannot hope to have a social existence which validates their choice. So in this case, you see that both equality and liberty, in a sense, seem matters that cannot be accessed without inviting a punitive response. And that, I think, is something that is something that we need to countenance in all its seriousness. Not only in terms of it being a gender problem or something to do with crimes of honor and so on, but as something which tells us about the limits to freedom and equality in our society. And such limits to freedom and equality are not always set by the state. And the state, in fact, in many instances, mirrors the kinds of truncated existence we consent to in civil society, that we say yes to in an everyday sense. So the mirror that the state holds to us is something magnified, is something huge and violent. But it's a mirror which sort of tells you that this is something we all assent to because this is something we accept as a default setting. So that is something that I sort of want to put on board before I go on to think through how are these issues, especially to do with liberty and equality, addressed in the register of anti-caste radical thought. Because I think if one is to sort of get out of what appears to be a fairly hopeless situation, one has to sort of access a different genealogy of ideas. A genealogy of ideas that endowed words such as liberty and equality with a different kind of resonance, with a different kind of weightage. So what I'm going to do is to take you very briefly through certain aspects of the thought of Ayotitas, the Dalit Buddhist who has emerged as one of the major intellectual figures in Tamil intellectual history, Periyar, and finally some of the writings of Ambedkar. So I'm not going to go into the details of who or what Ayotitas was, but he was a Dalit Buddhist who converted in the 1890s and went on to write a great deal. He founded a newspaper and he published a number of pamphlets and books and wrote this extremely rich and astounding biography of the Buddha, running into several hundred pages. Ayotitas in 1907, in the wake of the Swadeshi movement, ran a series of columns in his newspaper called Swadeshi Reform. And his intent was to sort of point to what seemed to him the problematic politics of Swadeshi nationalism, whether it emerged from Bengal or from Maharashtra or from parts of Tamil Nadu. And his argument was that those who propound the cause of Swadeshi, who ask to be ruled by their own representatives rather than by colonial government, he felt that their desire for freedom was a flawed desire. And that claim that they made on the colonial state was animated by four kinds of pride. One of it is caste pride, because many of whom were sort of protesting colonial rule were Brahmins. The second is a pride that comes from knowledge. An earlier generation of nationalists, as we know, spoke entirely in English, conversed with ideas that they inherited from a colonial educational context, and they used the very instruments that allowed them to do this against the colonial state. And to Ayotitas, this was deeply problematic because it seemed to him that here was a kind of game that was being played with words, which did not really address the lived realities of a vast number of people who labored on the fields, who labored as artisans, whose concerns were entirely different from those which he said animated the Swadeshi nationalists. And the third kind of pride that he spoke of was a pride that comes with wealth. And the fourth was the pride that comes with religion, which is in this case Brahmanical Hinduism. So for him, Swadeshi nationalism was inexorably Brahmanical, and in that sense was quite useless for those that wish to challenge the basis of such arguments. And in place of that, he proposed that what was missing in Swadeshi nationalism was an understanding of labor, of what people did, how they produced wealth, the kinds of situations in which they labored under, and the knowledge that comes out of labor. In his understanding, split words indulged in useless arguments, went on long semantic journeys that served no purpose. So to him, the knowledge that underwrote Swadeshi nationalism itself was problematic, and a different kind of knowledge was required if one wanted to truly sort of liberate the people of this country, many of whom were laborers. And what is interesting is that when he spoke of the people whose labor made the society what it is, he refers to them as the people. Whereas when he speaks of the Swadeshis and the nation that they wanted to imagine for themselves, that becomes for him an abstract category with no meaning at all. So social good can only come out of work done by the people, whereas political good as imagined in this anticipated nation is something that would only benefit the Brahminical classes. So this was a very strong and profound critique that he sort of made from 1907 to almost till the Surat Congress 1909, and it sort of captures for us the sort of issues that Dalit thinkers were grappling with when it came to an understanding of freedom and equality. Because clearly for him, political freedom could mean nothing if it did not also at the same time encompass an entire area of experience to do with labor and to do with Hinduism, which was deeply problematic. So that is something that is very important for us to keep in mind, because that is a theme that you see rehearsed again and again in anti-caste thought, that political democracy cannot mean much without social democracy. This is of course most fitfully conveyed by Ambedkar throughout his public life and in all his writings. But this is something that you can see is central to many strands of anti-caste thought. The securing of social democracy is every bit as important as the securing of political democracy, and in some cases has to precede it. Historically, that's how it has been, and so on. They produce a genealogy of thought which supports their argument, many of these writers. But with Ayodhya, you see something very interesting, because you find the category of labor being brought in very complex ways. The labor can be the foundation for knowledge and not a text. And I think that is something that's very, very interesting, because then freedom and equality come out of doing things, come out of being fraternal in a certain kind of way. And when Ayodhya talks about intellectual freedom, he does so in a very different sense in his biography of the Buddha, where intellectual freedom then is not so much about just criticizing Hinduism, which is something that he does fairly steadily and systematically, but it is also about the kind of ethical discretion that comes out of being a Buddhist. So intellectual freedom is to also to avail oneself of a way of looking at the world where you can discriminate between right and wrong on your own without reference to any founding text. And that I think is very, very interesting. Though he himself refers to a number of texts when he writes about Buddhism, he does not grant any one text centrality, which is very, very interesting, which is what Ambedkar also does in the Buddha and his Dhamma. No particular text is granted centrality, and it is the practice of Buddhism, as imagined by Ayodhya and Ambedkar, that becomes very central to a practice of liberty and equality. So that is something that we find in Ayodhya. And we come to Periyar's thought, you find again that his anger against Brahminical Hinduism, it's not only on account of the Shastras and the Puranas and the Manusmriti and what they have to say about caste. His anger was also because these have been updated to represent a form of nationalism. So for him, nationalism is an expression of the Brahmins' will to hegemony. In fact, he calls nationalism political Brahminism. So there is that sort of angry critique at nationalism. And very interestingly, his most consistent critique of the caste system emerges out of a critique of Swaraj, Tilak's notion of Swaraj, where he says, in a country where you have unapproachability and unseeability and untouchability, so what are the possibilities for self-rule? In a society which disallows self-respect, how can you even imagine that we are capable of self-rule? So again, the claims of equality and liberty within the context of caste is sort of forefronted in challenging the claims of nationalism. So within the caste order, of course, nothing is possible. So how does one then rethink this whole question of what it is to be free and what it is to be equal? What sort of social ethics or individual ethics or philosophy would actually make this possible? And in Periyar's long life, he experimented with a great many things. Some of these things came to fruition. Many others remained at the level of ideas and perhaps circulated amongst those that were interested in thinking through these matters. But unlike Ayodhya, and I think this is crucial, Labour was never central to his understanding of what could counter nationalism and a very truncated understanding of freedom and equality. Not that he did not refer to labor, but it remained at the level of argument rather than at the level of something that could emerge from the life worlds and practices of laborers. So, for instance, you have these two very interesting essays, one of which is called Common Property and Common Rights, where he's basically arguing with the socialists, and he says that common property is, at the end of the day, a matter of mathematical distribution, if it comes to that. Whereas to hold rights in common requires something else altogether. The division of property is not going to automatically mean that all of us become equal, in the sense that all of us can access rights equally. So again, he sets up this tension between the ideal society where there's a certain kind of economic equality, but which does not automatically guarantee social equality. And in another essay where he contrasts what he calls the wage laborer with the caste laborer, he speaks of how anyone who is a laborer in the caste system, and he refers to all these artisanal groups that labor with that are sort of skilled at particular artisanal trades and not at others, that their sense of themselves as proletarians does not come out of a sense of their worth as laborers. Any kind of self-expression that they seek is always an expression of wanting to be accepted by those above them. So, for instance, a blacksmith would want to court the status of a Vishwakarma, not want to be a modern laborer in an engineering factory. So, Periyar sort of plays with these ideas, but his whole critique of Brahmanical Hinduism and of the caste order is powerful not because he makes these arguments which are very compelling and which are very interesting, but which basically don't really allow you to think through labor in complex terms. But where he is most effective is when he urges forth the claims of a new selfhood that each of us has to fashion if you have to opt out of Manodharma. And how does one refashion this selfhood? Basically, it means that building a new sociability entirely. New practices of the self, you dress differently, you call yourself through different names. Social relations are sort of recast, men and women relate to each other in different ways. Women sense of what they are, not to be determined only by marriage or by reproduction, not by the fact that they ought to be wives or mothers, and a sense of comradeship that has nothing to do with blood kinship. So when it came to self-making, which would sort of allow an existence outside the caste system, Periyar was very profound and very rich in what he suggested. And the practice of the self-respect movement, especially from the 1930s to the 1950s, was sort of fairly defined, robustly defined. So much so even today, one could meaningfully talk of a subculture that emerged out of that time in history, however sort of frayed at the edges that subculture is today, and not at all adequate to the kind of violent assertion of OBC pride that you see and which results in the murder of young Dalit men and young OBC women. It may not be adequate to addressing that, but it still sort of points to how one may have to also think of liberty and equality in terms of who is this self that is going to be making these demands. Can these demands be made in abstract terms? The right to liberty or the right to equality simply cannot mean something that is affirmed by law. Though the Periyar movement also spent a lot of time working with the law, supporting the demand for representation, according a role for the state, and actually holding a kind of balance between the presence of various communities in public life, who ought to be in educational institutions, who ought to be in government, and so on. So the state was certainly assigned a role to play, but the state was not to be the sole arbiter of the fate of those who wish to live outside the caste order. So there was a lot that had to be done within the realm of civil society, within the realm of the family, in a very, very important and fundamental sense. So I think, just as with Ayodhya, you find that liberty and equality are sort of redefined within the realm of labor and within the realm of a Buddhist identity. Whereas in Periyar's thought, you find that liberty and equality sort of can only possibly be meaningful if it is the basis of an entire new practice of the self, the way you talk and walk and all the rest of it. So you find that in the Tamil anti-caste traditions that assertions of political liberty are not made the basis of our understanding of liberty at all. Liberty is something that has to enable you to question the caste order and to lead a life outside of its confines. And equality is something that is far more central in terms of how those who live within the caste order experience their everyday selves. And to an extent, one could even argue that the claims of equality preceded the claims of liberty. Though in actual practice it is hard to separate the two, the claims of equality were accorded priority in ways that made it very evident that unless there is that sense of equality, one cannot even proceed to talk of freedom. So freedom is made conditional upon an acceptance of equality. And freedom is not something that on its own automatically will create or enable the conditions that will make for equality. So that's a very interesting tension that I think we need to keep in mind, because it's a tension that continues in different ways as we try and unpack the meanings of freedom and equality in our contemporary context. Because one of the things that is very evident and obvious is that if one were to track the progress of events from the University of Hyderabad to JNU, you see that there is a progress in the way equality and liberty are sort of being handled by the Indian state and by the larger social order. So what emerges in Hyderabad is, after Rohit Vemula's tragic death, is that claims of equality and claims of liberty are sort of being intertwined in the kinds of demands that the young students there were putting forth. They were intertwined, but they're also separable. You could separate the one from the other. Because for the Indian state, it's obviously sort of very important that these claims do not always come together. When you come to JNU, you find that there's a precession of the claims of liberty. The claims of liberty are being urged forth with a certain insistence and a certain urgency. Notwithstanding the coming together of Jai Bhim and Lal Salam, there is still a certain insistence on the prior claims of liberty. I don't want to argue whether there should be prior and secondary claims, but I do think that these claims are inseparable in some ways. And that inseparability is argued in a very complex manner in the experience of anti-caste politics, where it is almost impossible to talk of liberty without actually urging for the claims of equality at the same time. Whereas it is possible to speak of political liberty without urging forth the claims of social equality. It is quite possible to do that. And it is not enough, obviously, to sort of just bring together blue and red. There is a way in which one needs to also learn to talk about the relationship of liberty and equality, which I think has been addressed in all their complexity in the practice of Dalit and non-Brahmin movements, but particularly in Dalit movements. So with this I come to Dr. Ambedkar, and I think what I would like to sort of take from Ambedkar's life and work at this, in a sense, in relation to all that I've been saying so far, is that, as we all know, in Ambedkar's thought, liberty, equality and fraternity are fairly inseparable. They are a tight-knit sort of trio that cannot be easily pulled apart from the other. On the other hand, Ambedkar makes it very clear that the claims of equality and the claims of liberty cannot be assumed to be the same, or that one can be prioritized over the other. And I think these are claims that have to be thought through together. And how may we think through them, think of these two claims together? Because as far as the caste system is concerned, the claims of equality are very central. But can one make those claims of equality without at the same time demanding a fundamental liberty for the self? So there is that issue also that is on board in Ambedkar's thought. And he very deftly sort of moves between urging forth the claims of equality to urging forth the claims of liberty. He moves very deftly between the two positions, depending on where he is, who he is addressing, and what is a particular issue at hand that he wishes to sort of resolve given the moment. But I think what is far more interesting is that if you were to think through Ambedkar's writings and the various ways in which he talks of liberty and equality, is that um, the claims of liberty cannot be granted an a priori importance. They have to be in every instance related to the claims for equality. That is something that is fairly central and fairly given. But the claims of equality itself is not something that remains stable throughout his long political life. The claims for equality acquire a different emphasis at different points in his long political career, and in his work with trying to imagine something that would be an ideal society outside of the caste order. So you have him sort of trying to balance the claims of equality and liberty in very complex ways, but often it's evident that he would sort of trump the claims of equality over that of liberty, without actually lessening the need for liberty that each of us has. So how does one do that? That's a fairly complex position to take. How does one actually speak of liberty and equality in ways that one doesn't subordinate the one to the other? But at the same time, one makes it very evident that the claims of equality cannot sort of be made to wait on the claims of liberty, which is what nationalism does in some ways in the days of the anti-colonial struggle, and which is also something that is sort of familiar to those of us who've engaged with it in terms of Marxism and left understanding of history, where there is always a persistent tension between liberty and equality. So there is that tension that is also central to Ambedkar's thought, and how do you sort of then work through these two competing claims? And what you find is in Ambedkar's writings that he sort of walks two axes at the same time. One is what he calls the axis of social democracy, and the other is the axis of political democracy. And it's important for him that social democracy is something that is accepted as equally valid as political democracy. But obviously these are not things that can be kept entirely separate. The claims of political democracy are very, very important, because this is the age of the republic, not the age of kingdoms and monarchies. But it cannot be therefore assumed that political democracy will automatically usher in social democracy. So how does one sort of walk this double line, where you keep insisting on the salience of both without sacrificing the interests of one to the other? And that is the biggest challenge that Ambedkar addresses. So let me just take a very simple example to indicate just how complex this project is in his thought. Very early on, when it comes to the presence of Dalits in the colonial legislature, Ambedkar makes this very significant difference between the right to represent and the right of representation. I think that is a very interesting difference that he makes, where the right to represent Dalits, their interest, is not something that can be handed over to anyone else but Dalits. Therefore, he coins the phrase the right of representation. Dalits must have the right of representation. Not that Dalit rights can be represented, but Dalits must have the right of representation. And that immediately sort of brings Dalit political agency into central focus. So right of representation is something that is central to the practice of democracy itself. So Dalit political agency then becomes a measure of democracy itself, so to speak. And where that agency is thwarted, you cannot have democracy. It's an equation that Ambedkar builds with great subtlety and very sort of rich arguments in all his writings. But basically what's important to him is to sort of indicate that the right of representation is something that Dalits have to be granted, and Dalits must grant themselves. And that is what is behind all his depositions, whether he's talking to the Simon Commission or whether he's at the roundtable conferences in the 1930s and so on. So it is the right of representation that he insists on. And that right of representation calls forth a new political subject in some ways, which is the Dalit political subject, who therefore uses that position granted to him, it's mostly him in those days, to argue for a different form of what Ambedkar calls the associational life, where politics itself is not so much a question of competing identities, but an occasion to come into a kind of fulsome associational life, where you can have political energies moving back and forth easily, where you can have a commingling of political selves. So then politics becomes a terrain where the burden of caste and the stigma of caste may be effectively sort of pushed into retreat in some ways. And politics becomes a terrain where you actually then sort of create the conditions for a kind of civic fraternity. So the right to representation is therefore very central to sort of arguing the kind of a position that Ambedkar wanted for Dalits in our political life. And this, of course, then requires the practice of a certain kind of social democracy on the part of the rest of the polity. So while Dalits sort of are to be invested with this right of representation, the rest of society is called upon to be fraternal. And that is a very complex and a very difficult task, but it's a mandate that Ambedkar imposes on caste Hindu society, which caste Hindu society is in no mood to perform either then or today. I mean, there's a very sort of casual shunning of fraternity. There's a very casual sort of disinterest in fraternity, so to speak. But fraternity is not something that Ambedkar wants only for Dalits. Fraternity is the founding basis for political democracy as far as he is concerned. But that is not something that can be sort of imposed. It has to be sort of experienced and accepted from within, which does not happen in his lifetime, nor has it happened in ours. But what is important is to sort of see Ambedkar grappling with this whole question of liberty and equality in very, very complex ways, that you cannot simply sort of make the claims of liberty precede the claims of equality. And that I think is very, very, very important, because often, even when it comes to sort of militant politics, the claims of liberty are urged forth as primary. And the claims of equality are always sort of claims that we are told may be honored once the fundamental claims of liberty are settled. And that is something women are very familiar with. And feminism has taken great trouble to sort of unpack that whole question of the rival claims of liberty and equality in very, very complex ways. So what you then have in Ambedkar's writings is a coming to the question of liberty and fraternity in ways that make it very evident that one cannot imagine liberty without making a concomitant affirmation of equality. And in caste society, to want to be equal is always an ethical risk, because caste society does not permit equality. It sort of does not condone equality. So it's a very sort of, it's a wager, it's a risk that you have to undertake. Equality is therefore fraught with problems, in a way that liberty is not. Because liberty is this sort of expansive, going outward, pushing against limits, pushing the barricades and so on. Whereas equality, you have to speak to your peers who are in this side. Pushing the barricades against those on the other side is one kind of a struggle. But to sort of work with the barricades that separate those of us who believe ourselves to be on the same side, that I think is a struggle that Ambedkar was very conscious of. And the difficulty of that struggle, he was under no illusions as to how difficult that was. So therefore, the claims of equality that he urges are claims that we need to think through very, very carefully. And I think in the context of all that has been happening over the last few months here, and in a sort of more sort of longue durée, what has been happening since the era of Dalit assertion for the last, say, 25 to 30 years, beginning with the late 80s, one sees that the ways in which we have dealt with the claims of liberty have been far more expansive and exciting than the ways in which we've dealt with the claims of equality. We have been minimalist when it comes to equality. We have been petty when it comes to equality. We have tried to sort of confuse equality with political and social safety nets. Our sense of equality is neither expansive, nor rich, nor deep, nor layered. It always seems as if it's something that you need to come in to mend things rather than actually radically rethink them. Whereas the proclivity to press forth the claims of Azadi are far more exciting, are far more interesting. And that is how it is. It ought to be with Azadi, clearly. But the claims of freedom, unless they are underwritten by the claims of equality, will result in another sort of wistful, sorrowful statement that "A azadi jhoot hai." You know, if this is something that was said so many years ago, this is something that we need to keep coming back to in today's context. One cannot constantly sort of work through the tortuous path to liberty only to experience a sense of loss, lack towards the end of that, and say this is not quite what we wanted. And perhaps the problem is not that the fight for freedom hasn't been relentless or it has not been exciting, but that fight for freedom cannot be completed on the terrain of freedom alone. It has to be sort of carried over into the terrain of equality in a very fundamental way. And given the graded equality of the caste system, one cannot assume that freedom automatically will bring in equality. I mean, this is the basis of Ambedkar's quarrel with the socialists from as early as the annihilation of caste till his very last writings, till the Buddha and his Dhamma, or Buddha or Karl Marx. The problem is that you cannot assume that the claims of freedom, that the claims of liberty automatically will usher in and validate the claims of equality. They do not and they will not. The claims of equality in caste society have to be urged forth on their own merits, on their own historical terms, in a society where such claims are not even allowed visibility, where it is impossible to make such claims, given the greater inequality of the caste order. So I think when it comes to sort of anti-caste radical thought, you find that there is this great tension between the claims of equality and the claims of liberty. It's a very productive tension. It's not a tension that sort of is settled one way or the other. And I think in today's context, it's a very useful thing for us to be thinking about, because one of the things that excites many of us who are not here physically present to witness the goings on at JNU or not at HCU either, is the sort of intertwined slogans of Lal Salam and Jai Bhim. And this is something that is exciting. This is something that all of us have a great investment in. But on the other hand, Jai Bhim cannot be made the basis of an instrumental logic. It cannot be made the basis of an instrumental logic. It cannot just mean the attachment of Jai Bhim to the more fundamental and given notion of Lal Salam. And I think that is something we may want to think through carefully, because I think the claims of anti-caste radical thought, the kind of arguments they've been making in favor of equality, have a very long and complex intellectual and political genealogy, a history of which we know far too little, and a history with which we don't engage unless and until a Dalit political presence pushes it into our face. It's only Dalit political agency that makes us sit up and take note of these claims. At other times, we don't see them as inevitably a part of the political. It's always an afterthought, an appendix. But if you were to sort of construct a history of political radicalism in India, which sort of takes the claims of anti-caste radical thought as seriously as, say, you would take the claims of socialism, then you end up with something very rich and very interesting. So, for example, when it comes to sort of discussions of Ambedkar, for example, was he a communist? Was he a communist hater? How did he view socialism and so on? One would then not ask those questions of Ambedkar. One would ask a very entirely different set of questions about Ambedkar. One would then perhaps ask, what is Ambedkar's socialism? It's not Ambedkar and socialism. Rather, it would be, what is Ambedkar's socialism all about? If one can grant that sort of a dignity to Maoism, one can grant that kind of a dignity to Leninism. So why does Ambedkar's socialism alone come under the kind of very sort of, for want of a better word, a kind of petty bickering? Where does that come from? So it seems to me that we need to grapple with the very complex manner in which anti-caste radical thought thinks through the claims of liberty and equality. Something that answers to the complexity of the caste question itself in our context. And that complexity cannot be made to go away. It cannot disappear on the basis of a singular agenda which brings together all of us all together at the same time. They do follow different temporalities. The temporality of equality is everything that can be settled in ways where Lal Salam is always resonant over Jai Bhim. Why must we imagine that that is the case always? Why can't we allow a sense of expansive freedom to Jai Bhim? I think there is something to be learnt there, something that we don't know enough about, and something that is visible in the lives, the quiet everyday lives of thousands of Dalits who have sort of confronted the caste system and managed to sort of pull themselves out of it and who lead very complex, interesting lives without the aid of a revolutionary practice that's obvious. So where does that come from? Where does that sense come from? And I think there's a lot to be learned in those lives and in those practices. So what I'd like to do is to sort of end on this note without going on. And it seems that what is required from us is a kind of risk. We need to risk saying that there is something we don't quite know about the future of something that's truly radical. That true radicalism cannot follow a script that we assume it ought to follow. It cannot follow a script that has to do only with left politics. It has to follow a script that is far more layered and far more complex. Does not mean that one can do it outside of left politics either. But it's a kind of risk that we need to take without constantly having to hedge ourselves in with a plethora of arguments, many of which sort of just collapse when you're faced with something like the demand of the Safai Karamcharis, or when you're faced with the kind of repetitive murders of young Dalit men. So in the face of those realities, you're compelled to think of azadi, or of equality, or of fraternity in ways that are not habitual and which can draw a great deal of sustenance from the anti-caste radical traditions of this subcontinent. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta, for that profoundly insightful discussion of the relationship between liberty and equality. I think we're very fortunate here to have these kinds of talks which unsettle some of the things which we perhaps take for granted in the slogans. And Geeta has invited us not only to go beyond and behind some of the slogans which we commonsensically mouth without thinking too much of what's gone behind them, but also has provided an extraordinary genealogy by taking the examples of Ayudas and Periyar and Ambedkar. I'm sure that there are questions. As I said, we're very fortunate to be able to have people like Geeta here with us in this series. And I'm very sure that people have questions. If you don't mind answering a few questions from the audience. So we'll take a few questions now. Yes.
It's a bit out of the topic of what you spoke today. But when you were citing about the recent murder of a Dalit in Tamil Nadu, you said that the persons who murdered him, it is not even the region where they are dominant. So I wonder, in a case like Kirvanmani or Dharmapuri, when someone writing against a group of Dalits, the region may matter. But in case of killing an individual Dalit, does it really matter whether the dominant caste, the caste is dominant in that region or not?
Can you take a few questions?
If anyone has.
Yes.
Thank you, Geeta, for the lecture. And I think mine is little long, maybe a rhetoric or I don't know what it means to be. Initially, you talked about the instrumental nature of left politics and Ambedkar politics, and eventually you went on to how the slogans of Jai Bhim and Lal Salam have to be problematized, I think, which are already problematized on campus, I feel. So I would give a simple example, or maybe I'm trying to understand. So this is not neither an allegation or an accusation, but I'm trying to understand the phenomenon. On campus, this is my second year, and the Ambedkar groups, so to put, who would say Jai Bhim, It's been a recent phenomena, maybe a year or so. But before the very first day, or maybe the entire year of my presence on campus, when there were no strong Ambedkar politics, they were cutting across all the organizations. I would definitely put all of them on the left. They were equally voicing the opinions, equally took the issue, equally dealt with the issue, I felt. However, the whole aspect of political agency for Dalits has been missing. However, so later with the Ambedkarite groups coming on the campus, and how the quintessential nature between a link between Jai Bhim and Lal Salam has been built up, and everybody, maybe they recognized or not recognized, has been a serious question of debate. So today, in terms of engaging with this question, it more looks like a contradiction than extension. Like, Jai Bhim's notion, the slogan's notion of freedom or emancipation will be definitely beyond not only caste but beyond everything else. So even so is Lal Salam's notion of freedom or understanding oppression is beyond. However, there is this urgency to recognize the bridges between both of them today in India, I feel. Because it's not that I also strongly believe that it's not all of a sudden all left politics or left practices recognize that there is oppression. So let's do Jai Bhim. So there is this dynamic social churning which is happening within the left groups as an organization or as among the people. So how do we deal this not with the cynicism but with a more of a positive understanding of going together in a more robust way, which will actually question the idea of equality in the society. Thank you. I'm sorry for
Respect to your first question about the murder of the young Dalit man. Is it an individual instance of can you just rephrase that question for me?
No, I mean, does in an incident
What does region matter?
Yeah, like, he could have been killed anywhere in Tamil Nadu or in India for that matter.
Well, region matters to an extent, I suppose, in terms of how local caste politics can sometimes escalate because of particular geographical and historical reasons and economic reasons. But I also think that in Tamil Nadu, especially over the last so many decades, as also in Maharashtra, which I think is an interesting contrast, you have a certain pattern, irrespective of the region, where I think Dalit male assertion has been viewed with great disdain and which has been sort of met with an amount of violence that is fairly unbelievable. So I don't know if the region matters so much. It matters in terms of how it happened and why it happened the way it did. But I think both in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, what you see is a kind of inability on the part of caste Hindu society. And here I'm not talking only of the Dvijas, who I think are out of the picture in an everyday sense. They don't live in the districts or the villages of or the small towns anymore. But between the BCs, OBCs and the Dalits, there's a certain kind of persistent and inherent tension which points to the sort of extremely incomplete nature of the democratic contract in these parts of the country, where we assume that that contract was fully in place because of Ambedkar and because of Periyar. And where I think the protocols of those contracts have never really been seriously examined. And it's evident that while there has been a sense of great expansive freedom for Dalits to exit from the caste order, the caste order is not seen as a stranglehold by the OBCs and by the BCs in all instances. I mean, to be sure, there are many who find it stifling. But it is also the case that the exit from caste does not mean the same thing to Dalits does not mean the same thing to Dalits and OBCs. But what you find happening in Tamil Nadu over the last so many years is also a kind of complete shamelessness. A complete absence of shame. And shame, as we know, is a very important political virtue in some ways. And there's a complete shamelessness and there's a certain impunity with which drawing on a history of being thwarted in the past, violence against Dalits is seen as completely legitimate in the present. The source of the thwarting is something else. The source of the victim of the violence is someone else. So I think what you find is a certain kind of political and intellectual laziness that has crept into the whole anti-caste rhetoric in places like Tamil Nadu. In Maharashtra, I think it's different. It's a lot more complex. But in both states, you find that happening, and it's not always clear whether this has to be treated as a very specific local phenomenon, or if it is sort of an expression of something bigger and wider. But in the case of Tamil Nadu, I would certainly see it as an expression of something bigger and wider.
Yeah, it's not even shamelessness. They see it like they claim it proudly. They surrender with the people.
Yes.
People marching behind.
Yeah. It is shamelessness, no? It's an absence of shame in any case. Your question is an important one, and certainly one need not sort of think of this in terms of cynicism at all. I do think one has to approach it with a sense of good faith. But it's also that there are so few precedents that will help us think through this carefully. I would like to sort of refer to this very interesting speech that Ambedkar delivered in 1943 on trade unionism. I think it is there in volume 17 of his of the English collection, where he has a very long and interesting sort of reflection on Dalits, labor, trade unions, and justice. And where he actually speaks of how it is important, even if one is part of a broad-based politics of labor, to constantly have to confront the question of caste within that. And how does one do that? What are the protocols that one may have to set in place? What is the kind of political register that one will have to have access to do that? Not that he offers you very clear-cut answers, but he identifies that as a very important issue to be dealt with if one were to build these broad bridges. And that is a very interesting point for us to take off and think through some of these issues as I understand them. But I think also what's very evident is that I'm not familiar with JNU at all, but I do know that at least in all many regional campuses, and I can only speak of Tamil Nadu with some amount of certainty, is that what has happened over the last 25, 30, 40 years, where you've had a kind of BC, OBC presence in public life and politics, is that university life, for example, has become extremely divided along caste lines with no sense of the possibility of a common conversation. And I think that is a phenomenon that we need to seriously address. And how do we start addressing that? And that cannot be done through good faith alone, because obviously there's a lot to gain and lose in doing that, right? And it has also to do with the larger anti-caste politics that some of our states had, and which has gone into retreat for any number of reasons. And so this cannot be a matter that you settle only on the terrain of left politics. It also raises very important questions about the nature of a vibrant anti-caste politics. So you don't have to have the one in opposition to the other, but if one were to have a rejuvenated political life, it has to also be a rejuvenated anti-caste politics as much as a rejuvenated left politics. It cannot be that a regenerated left politics takes on board the caste question and resolves it. There are two different traditions. These traditions might intersect, might not intersect, but there's a way in which they may be able to speak to each other in a complex, rich manner, in a contentious manner. So, and I think there is cause for good faith in what one has seen in JNU and what one sees at HCU to some extent. So.